Next up, we're going to talk about the neuroscience of ADHD. So remember that ADHD is a syndrome, right? So it's a constellation of symptoms. And so you don't have to have every symptom in the diagnostic and statistics manual for ADHD. Some people will have some symptoms, other people will have other symptoms. So as a clinician, one of the things that I found is very, very helpful is to really understand which are the particular vulnerabilities that a patient with ADHD has. And if we understand what those vulnerabilities are, and we understand kind of how they work and where they come from, we can also develop a very tailored plan to kind of combat their ADHD and sort of bring them up to speed or restore some of their function. So this is where we're going to start with neuroscience. And I know this is going to be complicated, but I spent a lot of time learning this stuff, which means that you're going to spend a lot of time learning it too. And it ain't necessarily going to be easy, but I do think that it's going to be very, very helpful. So the cool thing about the neuroscience of ADHD is that a lot of the deficits that we see actually map onto the brain. And once we understand what's going on in the brain, it gives us a roadmap for how to fix things. So let's start by looking at a couple of the regions of the brain that are involved in ADHD. So the first region that we're going to talk about is the amygdala. And the amygdala is our negative emotional center of the brain and is also our survival center of the brain. So it's where we experience things like fear or concern or worry, and it also helps us react and survive in very difficult situations. So it's fundamentally a negative emotional part of the brain. Another part that's really important, this is kind of a big part, is something called the insula. And the insula also governs different kinds of negative emotions and is going to become kind of important in ADHD. So if we look at the brains of people with ADHD, what we find is that their insula and amygdala tend to be smaller in volume than the average brain. And so that may sound kind of weird because you may think, well, if it's smaller, doesn't that mean you experience less emotion? Whereas oftentimes in the brain, the opposite is true. So a lot of what the brain's tissue does is inhibit stuff. And so for some reason, when we see smaller volumes in the brain of things like the amygdala and the insula, it correlates with more emotional responsiveness in ADHD. So something that we'll see in people with ADHD is that sometimes their emotions get the better of them. They kind of become a little bit impulsive. The next part of the brain that we're going to talk about is the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is part of our fundamental dopamine reward circuitry. And we're going to cover that more elsewhere in the guide as well. But our nucleus accumbens is like what motivates behavior and sort of allows us to feel reward. And we see a couple of important connections here. The first is that in the brains of people with ADHD, the amygdala and the insula have stronger effects on the nucleus accumbens than the average brain. And so what that sort of means is that the behaviors that we engage in are more sensitive to emotions. And that may sound kind of weird, but I'll give you kind of a simple example. So oftentimes people with ADHD will behave very impulsively. And so if we think about what makes a behavior impulsive, like you don't really think about it ahead of time, you sort of suddenly engage in it. And that sudden engagement can oftentimes be due to an emotion. So in sort of a neurotypical individual, what we'll find is that there may be an emotion, but it doesn't immediately translate into behavior. Whereas in ADHD, an emotion is more likely to suddenly create a behavior. So the nucleus accumbens is where we get a sense of reward. And also in ADHD specifically, this is where some of the impulsivity comes from. The next part of the brain that we're going to talk about is the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is involved with execution and planning of behavior. So for example, this is more generally our frontal lobes, but if I am trying to clean up my room, let's say, or pack for a trip, packing for a trip is an abstract task that has to be broken down into individual pieces. So I have to go grab my toothbrush, grab my toothpaste. Oh, by the way, this tube of toothpaste is too big and security won't let it through, so I need to go get a travel toothpaste. I need underwear, I need these kinds of clothing, I need to take a nice pair of clothing and some casual clothing. Oh, by the way, the hotel I'm staying at has a pool, so I'm also going to take a swimsuit. So if we think about planning tasks and executing on them, that's what our frontal lobes do. So our prefrontal cortex is important for that. We'll get to that in a second. We'll get into more detail in a second. The next part that we're going to talk about is the orbitofrontal cortex. And the orbital frontal cortex is responsible for regulating emotions and decision-making. Okay? So we kind of mentioned here that the amygdala and insula are going to have a strong effect on the nucleus accumbens, and therefore emotions will lead to impulsivity. Whereas remember that when we feel like doing something, our brain can actually put the brakes on those feelings, right? So let's say that I feel like yelling at my boss, and I feel that very strongly. The emotion is there, the desire is there, but in my brain, it's kind of like putting the brakes on that. So we don't actually want to yell at my boss. And there's a part of my brain that says, don't do that. That part of the brain in general is going to be the PFC, but the orbitofrontal part of the brain, or the orbitofrontal cortex specifically. The next part that we're going to talk about is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or the DLPFC. So the dorsolateral PFC is the part of our brain that specifically weighs options. Okay, so it looks at things like pros and cons, risks and benefits, alternatives. This is also where contrafactual thinking comes from, if y'all are familiar with that term. And so essentially our frontal cortex is going to govern a lot of the regulation of other parts of our brain. And this is where it's really important to understand how some of the treatments of ADHD work. So if we think about people with ADHD, their minds tend to move very fast, they get distracted really, really easily, and their thoughts are bouncing all over the place. And what we've found in psychiatry is that we can give people stimulant medication to improve their ADHD. And that may be kind of confusing, but because our experience, if you have a neurotypical brain, is that if you take something that is a CNS or central nervous system or brain depressant, it's going to slow down your thinking. So alcohol will make you think kind of slower, whereas caffeine will kind of speed up your thinking, right? So it gets kind of confusing because if ADHD is very rapid thinking, how can a stimulant medication actually slow down their thoughts? Well, it turns out that what stimulant medications do is actually stimulate the frontal cortex. So what we're actually boosting the signal of is our ability to control the rest of our brain. So stimulant medication essentially strengthens our brakes. And I think about the prefrontal cortex as the brakes of our brain. There's one other part of the brain that's important to talk about, which is kind of here, for lack of a better location, which is the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC. And the anterior cingulate cortex is very important because it's essentially the road or the connection between the PFC and our emotions and nucleus accumbens. So what we find in the brains of people with ADHD is their anterior cingulate cortex is kind of weaker, or in a sense, the connections between the prefrontal cortex and their emotional circuitry is weaker. So what we find is that in a neurotypical brain or a normal brain, our frontal cortex is more able to restrain our impulses, more able to restrain our emotions. But in people with ADHD, that connection appears to be weaker. So these are the main components of the brain that we're going to be focusing on in ADHD. And the key thing to remember here is that if we look at the symptoms of ADHD, or what people with ADHD struggle with, we can see that they map to particular regions of the brain. So for example, some people with ADHD are disorganized and have problems with organization. And what that essentially goes to is the frontal lobe. So this is a frontal lobe problem. Other people with ADHD really struggle to regulate their emotions, right? So they can't control their emotions. They get emotional very easily. And so what that may be is sort of a weakness of the ACC. Could also be sort of a consequence of the amygdala and the insula being smaller. And then this is where we start to see a lot of the more nuanced behavior of ADHD. Like there isn't an impulsivity part of the brain. Impulsivity doesn't map to one area of the brain, but we can still understand impulsivity within the brain by looking at the influence of other kinds of connections. So impulsivity it has to do with our nucleus accumbens, our reward circuitry, being very, very sensitive. And this is the other thing, is that we'll kind of see that like emotions can shape that behavior in people with ADHD more powerfully. And that has to do with their connections between the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens. And we'll also lay out the foundation for intervention. So for example, about 10 to 25% of people will actually grow out of ADHD to some degree. And how is that possible? What happens as we age? What happens as we age is that the frontal lobes actually strengthen. So some small percentage of people with ADHD, as their frontal lobes grow, they're just growing slower than the neurotypical person. They actually are able to organize better. They're able to organize fine at the age of 30. They're able to inhibit their emotions fine. We can also see how things like medications can act at particular areas of the brain and treat symptoms of ADHD. We can also see meditation and how meditation can be an evidence-based treatment for ADHD. And this is where things get kind of interesting, because there are different kinds of meditation, right? So some meditations are all about focusing and controlling your mind. Other meditations are about impulse control and not giving in to your impulses. Other meditations are about emotional tolerance, being able to accept your emotions and not react to them. So we can even see how tailoring our meditative technique can target particular shortcomings in the brains of people with ADHD. So this is going to be just an overview, and now what we're going to do is go into more specific challenges that people with ADHD have. Now that we understand kind of how everything fits together, we'll dive into specific problems and see what's happening in the brain.